Hello everybody, you're very welcome. I hope everybody is able to see my screen. I'm Ronan Laffan, Head of Advisory Services in version 1. This webinar today we're talking about public, private, hybrid cloud, what businesses need to know. In terms of what we want to cover today, I want to look at, in some way, why are people going to cloud? In terms of assessing the impact of cloud, it's important to start with an understanding of what people are actually trying to achieve when going to cloud. We're going to look at some of the trends that we as consultants in this space are actually seeing in terms of cloud adoption, which particular clouds, and the kind of architectures people are actually adopting with an enterprise view. So we're not necessarily looking at customers who are pure cloud native digital companies, but actually typical enterprises and what they're actually looking at. And we're going to look at, well, approaches to choosing strategies in terms of what adoption and those strategy people are following. So really, we're here trying to maximize the business benefits our customers can achieve through going to cloud. Typically, it's part of much larger programs. Typically, they're looking for very defined business objectives, and cloud isn't an end in itself by any means. Cloud is just one of the many, many tools, and it's an evolution of things we've already been doing for many, many years. Version 1 provides many services in the cloud space, and we partner with a number of leading cloud providers from Amazon, Microsoft Azure, Oracle, but really we're looking at it as part of a larger capability for most organizations. It's not just a technology. There's many things that have to be put in place correctly, and the objectives and goals people are trying to achieve from this. Typically, it's very important to start out with a detailed understanding of that and build a cloud strategy that's based on clear business benefits. So what are those drivers? Well, some people are moving to SaaS applications and they need to be able to connect to those. Some people are trying to introduce DevOps into their life cycles. And we're certainly seeing that in all sorts of organizations. So, for example, many government bodies build bespoke applications, and increasingly their development teams are trying to get the maximum benefits, the maximum productivity. They're trying to get away from long life cycles where looking for new infrastructure takes a long time, but also they're looking for the benefits of DevOps for full automation. So they end-to-end testing and rapid iterations in agile processes, not necessarily continuous delivery. They're not trying to emulate, typically in enterprise environments, they're not trying to emulate the LinkedIns or the Facebooks of the world, but they are trying to get many of the same benefits, and sometimes those benefits are even in compliance because we can automate and script environments, script the tests, and guarantee the quality that goes out. There are obviously the cloud natives. There are companies who really are just digital companies who the cloud is the only home for them. They don't have physical premises, they don't have physical business. Cloud is where they live. There are companies also who are probably traditional business who are actually working to remove all infrastructure. Interestingly, we have customers in financial services, for example, whom have no physical infrastructure. So they might be working in an environment which most people consider to be highly regulated, very slow moving, and yet they're avid cloud adopters, removing all their physical infrastructure. We've seen many cases where bursty temporary workloads, which don't fit well into the classic data center environment, they're a perfect thing to move, in fact, a key driver. And we've seen that even in insurance companies, for example, running calculations, risk profiling calculations, for example. Classic, put it up in the cloud, scale it out to ridiculous scale, get the answer done. But if you can change how long it takes that type of workload, you change the nature of the calculation. You can do it at very low cost if you do it, and you can scale it out massively. And if something that previously took overnight or worse is suddenly possible in minutes or half an hour or something like that, it changes the nature of the business process behind it. And there are also certainly cases where people have temporary workloads, approaching some key deadline. There's a website or some web internet facing functionality or some internal functionality that's required, and scaling it out in cloud is perfect in terms of that. There are also the bottom, talking about cloud native workloads. And there are certainly technologies emerging in cloud which really don't have equivalents on-prem, and that's typically in now we're beginning to see it in artificial intelligence and machine learning. And you know, up till now we've been seeing it in workloads like mobile application development, where the mobile clients can be given notifications and so on based on cloud services that don't necessarily have equivalents in data center. Strangely, the one bottom left, securing the data center from the internet, is an interesting one. We've certainly seen cases where you are actually improving the security of your data center by not putting those nasty internet-facing workloads into it, but instead you're deploying them to the cloud and only connecting back to your data center with very specific secured traffic. And that's certainly an interesting approach, which is actually about improving the security of data center, improving the security of my back-end systems, and using cloud for that kind of dangerous place that is the internet. Certainly, when we'll talk about it later, there's certainly customers who are using it just specifically for mass storage and very cheap bulk storage, and sometimes backup, without fully running compute or active nodes typically in cloud. And it's kind of a reasonable, safe way of beginning to introduce some cloud solutions. There are definitely people using it for DR, where their primary data center continues in other locations in traditional data centers or on-prem, but they're looking for the benefits of getting full DR and building at least some of that infrastructure in cloud and running just replication out to cloud. And strangely, the one that we hear the least of all, even though it's the one that seems to get press coverage, is cost. Really, that's not why we find people going to cloud. Typically, they're looking for much more clear business benefits. And you could say, in one sense, for example, if I take bursty workloads, if I needed all the physical servers to do the same thing, that would be a ridiculous cost. So you could say cost comes in that case. But it's not the primary driver. It probably is that cloud allows you to do things that would be cost prohibitive in other ways, but really when they're looking at it, they're talking about either I can do it this way, I can do it in cloud, or I wouldn't do it at all. So cost isn't exactly it. Now, there can be cases where there's massive cost savings, but sometimes cloud costs more. So you have to be very careful about what you're actually looking for. So I suppose a key thing that we do see is that every enterprise sees cloud differently. And that's not something that seems to get talked about, but there are very different viewpoints, starting places, and goals that every enterprise seems to set. And it's important to do that for yourself and be clear as to what you're actually trying to achieve. I suppose a key question is, which public cloud? And obviously we work with a number of them, and there are others, in one sense countless others, of reasonably big clouds, which may be tier 2, you could call some of them, but some of them may align to technologies you already have. So obviously you have other players such as IBM and VMware, but really we're seeing predominantly these are the clouds that we are seeing people talking about, and while there are many others, this is the set that we're typically encountering in our customers. I'll talk a little bit more about them. If I take an independent report by RightScale, so their 2017 State of the Cloud report, it's interesting to see. So they certainly are seeing AWS as the largest public cloud that has been adopted in enterprises and SMBs, followed strongly by Azure. So Azure has very strong growth, and you can see the difference there. From 26% of their respondents had said they're using Azure in 2016, and that was massively increased up to 43% respondents in 2017. And that's certainly what we're seeing in terms of enterprise adoption. We're seeing massive growth in Azure, and it's fitting a lot of workloads. I suppose an interesting one following on the tails of that is Google Cloud. And we'll talk a little bit about that, where it's beginning to play. Well, maybe we're not an IBM partner, but we haven't seen very much use of IBM Cloud. There are certainly customers who work in IBM data centers who are likely to adopt IBM Cloud solutions. but we certainly are seeing quite a bit of penetration of Oracle Cloud, and we'll talk about a little bit about that too. So just another way of summarizing that, AWS, Azure, and I suppose they're separating out in this graphic the difference between IaaS and PaaS. It's certainly interesting in the architectures, and then they're down into other clouds. So let's just talk a little bit about where we see strengths and where typically what that means. So I suppose what we're definitely seeing is we're seeing the strength in enterprise applications migrating to cloud. A lot of enterprises who probably were slow starters are now moving to Azure because integration with AD, probably already in place if they've already implemented something like Office 365. It certainly allows them to have a uniform enterprise network that extends into Azure with authentication against the corporate standard, which will be AD through Azure AD and Federation, and probably domain controllers deployed into Azure if they're running IaaS infrastructure. We're certainly seeing the growth and use of PaaS services, so app services and Azure functions and various other aspects of PaaS within Azure, particularly where customers have development teams who are building in .NET. So Microsoft have a very strong play. It integrates excellently with the tool sets, and it fits very well with customers who are already comfortable with Microsoft technologies, which actually accounts for a lot of enterprises. It's fair to say that Amazon were leaders from the outset in the whole public cloud arena, and it's also fair to say that they are very strong with, let's call them, cloud native companies. So digital companies whose services, and in this context business services, really they don't have on-prem infrastructure. And from the outset they've been extremely strong in that. Now obviously other clouds can do exactly very equivalent types of functionality, but they remain strong in that type of space. They obviously also have enormous capabilities in terms of other technologies, in terms of the growth of machine learning, and obviously they've been building things like Alexa themselves, and they're certainly growing rapidly in that space. But equally, they too have strong PaaS services. They have very strong database platforms. They have a full stack that's absolutely industry leading. That's certainly very relevant to any enterprise. Interesting, Google has rapidly begun to appear in customer conversations. There's two areas where we're seeing those conversations. One is people are obviously aware of Google's strength in machine learning and in artificial intelligence, and that's certainly one area of the market where they're beginning to get significant interest. I'm not going to say that we have seen too many production workloads go to it, but certainly we've seen a lot of customers talking about it who are interested in that space. Interesting, we also see there are some retailers we've seen in the market who have become uncomfortable with living on Amazon and see Amazon as a competitor in the retail space, and Google have actively gone after that market, a simple cloud platform for IaaS and PaaS, but targeting retailers as a sector who are uncomfortable with Amazon. And finally, Oracle Cloud. And it might say, where's its strength? Well, the strength is people who run Oracle workloads. Now, we happen to have done quite a lot of work of migrating people with Oracle workloads onto Azure and also onto Amazon. But it remains the case that Oracle themselves have a very strong platform, a very cost-effective platform, and potentially some licensing benefits if you happen to be running Oracle workloads. And Oracle Cloud is a very strong cloud, but we haven't seen adoption outside of people deploying predominantly core Oracle workloads. But it certainly is a very strong case if you are running Oracle. I suppose the key thing to ask is, cloud isn't just IaaS, it isn't just PaaS. SaaS is actually massive in most enterprises. And from Salesforce through to Dropbox, through to Google business applications, it is absolutely vital to many, many businesses. And actually, it's a key thing to consider in terms of your overall architecture as moving to cloud, because typically we're not just talking about IaaS and PaaS applications, we're talking about connecting these other external applications running as SaaS, and yes, end users access them via browsers, and if we want to integrate them, we're probably talking about RESTful services that we have to integrate into the rest of our applications in the rest of our estate. And so if you imagine something like Oracle Fusion applications where we're running ERP or financials or something like that, we get to very interesting, complex, and very important questions from the outset of how's that going to integrate. How are we going to get data in? How are we going to get data back out? How are we going to do MI and reporting? What else does that have to talk? And do we have appropriate integration technology? SaaS has many, many types of applications, and you certainly see it across HR, recruitment, many areas of your business. You probably have business units who are beginning to adopt, and sometimes it's quite hard to control that, the black ops of SaaS adoption. But look, there is massive growth in general, kind of SaaS applications, such as the ones we kind of mentioned there, but also domain-specific SaaS applications. So I know we've done quite a lot of work with some utilities customers, and part of their journey to the cloud has been driven by the fact that when they now procure applications, which might be to do something like monitor maintenance cycles on power generation plant, those are now typically delivered by their suppliers as SaaS applications first. And so they are being driven to the cloud in part because what was traditional off-the-shelf software is now SaaS. That is the default delivery mechanism for many software vendors today. And that is actually driving us all to the cloud, whether we want to or not. And that a lot of SaaS applications in amongst whatever else we happen to choose with the rest of our networks. I suppose just one area to discuss briefly is private cloud. So most organizations, if they do run a data center, are running some level of private cloud. So VMware, Hyper-V, and potentially if you're running specific workloads such as Oracle, you may have appropriate technology such as Oracle's own virtualization stack. This is absolutely, it has been the case for many years, and it will continue to be the case. And it's not really radically changing. VMware probably has a greater element of the market than Hyper-V, but really we're seeing migration to public cloud as being the bigger trend rather than any rapid increase in private cloud. Interestingly, in this RightScale survey, they highlight the growth of something like OpenStack, but I can honestly say that that isn't an area that we've seen in Ireland and the UK. We haven't seen large amounts of OpenStack deployed in our customers. It's probably that there are specific market segments where that's emerging. Interestingly, you do have people like Microsoft beginning to release versions of Azure where you can effectively in the future you will be able to spin up your own little piece of Azure in your own data center. Again, that's something people might be experimenting or saying they have plans to use, but we're not there at this point in time. So virtualization is everywhere. It'll continue to be everywhere. And you know, that's not a trend that's going to go away, but actually a lot of these workloads, well, they may begin to move to public cloud in the future. And that's the greater trend that we're certainly seeing. So what is this hybrid cloud thing? Well, if you go across vendors, there are multiple hybrid cloud stories from most vendors. So on the top left, there's VMware's Cloud Foundation story, which allows you to move workloads from vSphere, on-prem, private cloud, have some degree of virtualization of your STAN and storage, move things, workloads, storage into public cloud, and seamlessly move things backwards and forwards applications. Microsoft certainly have stories which are not dissimilar, but in practice what we see is Microsoft Azure Site Recovery Manager being used to take data and workloads from customers' physical servers and virtual infrastructure, private cloud, and move them into Azure. The diagrams that Microsoft show always have two-way arrows. We can move data into the cloud and back again. In practice, depending on the source architecture, it can be quite complex to actually move back if you do actually fail over. If you're using this, for example, as for DOR, it can be difficult to actually move back. So it certainly is something we see a little bit of, but it's not quite as big a deal as probably the vendors all thought it was going to be. So we're probably seeing more people either running private cloud or running public cloud, and less people running this kind of seamless, let's move back across. That promise of a seamless shift, as seen in the Microsoft Azure site recovery side, it's not always as simple as that. We are certainly seeing this type of technology used as a way of implementing DOR, and sometimes giving you backup as well. But typically, we're not seeing it realize the full promise that had been talked about for some time. Public cloud may have secure networking. In general, people will implement some form of VPN or a dedicated connection back to their corporate network, but generally there's a strong segregation between the two networks. So they will typically build their public cloud network with best of breed security. If they've done it with any degree of thought, that's what we're generally seeing. So we'll have, proper subnet design. We'll have logical separation of applications and groups of applications into discrete subnets, discrete subnet layering, and careful control of the traffic from that back to the corporate network. So people will typically use the opportunity of going to public cloud to design a public cloud network that is absolutely best of breed secure. One of the ways to allow yourself get through your security policies to allow yourself begin to deploy important workloads up to public cloud is to do it better than you would have done it on-prem, to apply better levels of security, resilience, and networking design as a way of mitigating the risks, but equally getting some benefit, some compliance benefit as we do so. I guess more importantly for me as a hybrid cloud question is, how do we actually do the integration between the types of services that we deploy to public cloud, how the services we consume as SaaS services, and connect those back into the rest of what we have in our data centers or on our premise, as the case may be. And that's not a trivial question, but because sometimes we need to change the types of interfaces we use as we increasingly use SaaS applications. So for example, there's a great shift to RESTful applications, and we can't actually directly access, for example, their underlying databases. And there can be significant questions around getting data from public cloud and getting it into our things like data warehouses and getting processes end-to-end, starting potentially in SaaS applications coming through potentially cloud deployed applications and ending up, for example, in our financials or ERP systems, which may continue to exist on-prem. They're the really important hybrid cloud questions. How do we build this architecture which has applications in many places? I think in my diagram here, I've given an example of some design from an Azure perspective, looking at this came out of a particular customer engagement, but the use of something like API management, service bus, logic apps, were key in that case to actually being able to integrate flexible multiple types of services where potentially CRM is a third-party SaaS application such as Salesforce or Dynamics 365 deployed in the cloud. But we need to be able to take that data back, integrate it with other applications in potentially billing systems or other types of ERP that we may actually have. So designing for hybrid cloud from the outset is a key skill, and it's something that really you have to build expertise in. So we're seeing people build links, secure links between public cloud and private networks. We see appropriate questions being asked around firewalling between the two and about network segregation between both sides, and appropriate technologies being put in place to integrate through SaaS applications. And that means typically people are being challenged by for example, the integration technology they may have used in the past. It may have been data-centric approaches which may not work with SaaS. They may have legacy SOA infrastructure, messaging infrastructure, which may not do RESTful web services, for example. And so the use of cloud-oriented integration technologies is certainly something we see as a trend in terms of driving towards hybrid cloud. In terms of other architectures, so we've obviously customers who are building raw servers and deploying them as IaaS. We have customers who are building bespoke applications, and increasingly we're seeing those deploying to platform services. So in Azure, it might be app service, and obviously there are equivalent types of technologies going on in AWS. There are people moving away from traditional relational databases and moving to database platforms and NoSQL platforms, so the DynamoDBs of the world, for example, in AWS. And obviously, we've talked a little bit there about software as a service. There are a lot of other trends being talked about, though, such as containers, so the rise of Docker, and if you happen to read a lot of tech journals, you're going to hear an awful lot about that. And I suppose it's interesting for me because actually we haven't seen that trend anything to the extent that it's talked about in industry. It remains something that's I read about, but I'm not seeing large amounts of customer adoption. It does offer certain promises that are relevant to this kind of hybrid environment. They're relevant because potentially I could build applications that are pretty well self-contained, it might be able to scale out, but equally would be portable between different clouds because they use less cloud features. In one sense, that's a trend that is in the opposite direction to building applications that use PaaS, that use, for example, app service on Azure, because you're building applications that are more independent of particular cloud vendors. In one sense, you're not getting the benefit of particular strengths of a cloud vendor because you're making yourself independent. You're wrapping and deploying full application stacks into virtualized servers and deploying them into containers onto your chosen cloud. But we're not seeing massive growth in that, even though obviously there's a lot of talk about Docker. Maybe it's something that will come at us. I've talked a little bit about integration platform as a service, or iPaaS. That's certainly something that's very important to get right. We are seeing a lot of discussions around that. And one other one to talk about briefly is serverless compute. There's always a server. It's a term I dislike for that reason. But there are definitely cases where they're beginning to deploy Azure functions or Lambdas in AWS. There's certainly a trend that is beginning to evolve where I no longer am concerned. Certainly it's not about an IaaS. It's not even a traditional concept of PaaS. There are individual bits of code that get executed and can scale out on demand. And certainly that's a trend we're beginning to see in application architecture. The trend of microservices tied to serverless is something that's definitely substantially changing the way people are coding, the way people are deploying, and it certainly aligns very well with the DevOps type lifecycle and tooling that's out there today. So if you look at kind of RightScale's view of what type of services people are using today, predominantly still people are building relational databases. They may be databases as a service. They are beginning, when there are certain types of things like push notifications, that's obviously relates to certain types of application scenarios such as mobile apps. They're using those types of services, and that's one of the drivers for driving people to cloud. But a lot of cases, people are still building relatively traditional applications. So how many clouds should we build maturity in? How many clouds should we actually be using? It's all about maturity. If you've got one isolated workload, you're low organizational risk, it doesn't really matter which cloud. You can have one competent team, off you go. If you've got many enterprise workloads, you've got much higher risk, and you need to be much more mature, and you need to be much more competent, and that begins to be a question. So for us, cloud maturity is key. You've got to be good at any technology to get the full benefits from it, and cloud is no different. So when we actually started this, if you invest your cloud competence in a single cloud, it's much more likely to deliver you the benefits. You're much more likely to be good at it. You're much more likely to make less mistakes. So in general, it makes sense to mature first in a single cloud and build competence in that, build tooling before you start jumping into working in many, many clouds. We do see, though, multi-cloud strategies having strengths where if you do have isolated teams or working on different applications and they happen to have divergent needs, different needs for particular clouds may have particular strengths, if those teams have low levels of integration, they're pretty independent of each other, well then, yeah, maybe it does make sense to match the team with what cloud best fits their needs, best fits their skills, best fits the application in question. you can choose a specific cloud for its specific strengths. And the other area where multiple clouds begins to matter is where you actually are specifically further down the road and you're choosing cloud diversity for resilience. So potentially the creation of backup sites in a different cloud, and that might be in the case of an IaaS infrastructure or in a serverless or in a containerized infrastructure. But it certainly becomes more difficult as soon as you start choosing services, PaaS services that tie you to a particular cloud, then you don't have that option in the same way. I suppose a key to strategy for actually dealing with that is obviously as you were moving to the public cloud, hopefully you start with a bit of planning and start with a bit of piloting and trying to understand and learn and put some real workloads into the public cloud before we start scaling out with many workloads. And as we do that, it's very important that in parallel we're building our excellence, our maturity, our organizational processes and governance and tooling and getting the full benefit out of what we're doing. And only as we get to that point, then the real questions around diversification should begin to emerge. But I'd say keep your eggs in one basket initially, and as we scale, and at some point down the line, then you can begin to ask more complex questions, but it's not where we start. I suppose the key thing is there are measures and there are ways of measuring your cloud competence and your cloud maturity. So one that we have used is the surveys that the Open Data Center Alliance publish, and certainly is a good way of testing yourself in terms of your own maturity. And you know what we're seeing is organizations are, as they adopt more applications and push more to the cloud, they do need to grow that maturity. They need to have a plan of building skills across every level in the organization and making cloud not just something accidental, but something that's well managed and planned and fits into the overall IT strategy and competence of the organization. We can help, hopefully, and we have a set of services that help go from early stage when people are trying to identify strategies through design using reference architectures and applying good process design through this, in building your cloud services and in operating your cloud services. And as we have applications out there deployed, coming back and occasionally engaging in reviews to actually drive improvements and actually feedback and drive maturity. So I hope people found that useful and thought-provoking. I'll finish up there. So thank you all very much for your time, and I hope we'll be talking in the near future.